"Sir, help us." "Please," the young woman cried, her voice trembling in the cold metallic room. She clutched the small child to her chest, her simple, worn-out uniform, a stark contrast to the billionaire's silent fury. But Marcus Thorne didn't hear her. He wasn't looking at the security monitors showing the intruders. His gaze was frozen on the little girl's face, on her wide, terrified eyes. It was impossible. The same small nose, the same splash of freckles, the same eyes. He wasn't seeing the nanny's daughter. He was seeing the ghost of his own. What happened next in that room would change everything. Like this video, and subscribe to find out the full story. For a man who sold the world impenetrable security, the sudden dead silence was the most terrifying sound of all. Marcus Thorne stood motionless in the atrium of his glass and steel mansion, a ghost in his own fortress. The ambient hum of the climate control, the soft whisper of the water wall, all of it had vanished, replaced by a vacuum that felt heavy, unnatural. Then came the visual confirmation, a single pulsing red light strobing across the obsidian floor, a silent scream from the heart of his security system. A breach, not a clumsy smash and grab, but a professional surgical intrusion. His mind raced not with fear, but with cold, sharp-edged analysis. Was this retaliation for the Triton acquisition? Or something more personal, a ghost from the high-stakes game of corporate espionage he had just won? He had made powerful enemies. He didn't waste a second. His movements were fluid, economical, a predator in his own habitat. He strode past priceless art and minimalist furniture, his destination singular the core. The panic room, the one place on Earth he had designed to be inviolable. On the lower level, in the sterile white corridor of the staff wing, Sarah Jenkins had felt the same shift in the atmosphere. The gentle nightlight in Lily's temporary bedroom flickered once then died. The air suddenly still felt thick in her lungs. Her training as a nurse had taught her to recognize the signs of a crisis, and her instincts as a mother screamed that something was terribly wrong. She looked down at her 5-year-old daughter Lily, asleep in the small bed, her face serene, oblivious. A wave of fierce, primal protection washed over Sarah, eclipsing all thought. The agency's emergency protocol was clear, drilled into her on her first day in the event of any lockdown get the child to the core. She scooped Lily into her arms, the child's warm, sleepy weight, a familiar comfort against the rising tide of her own fear. Barefoot clad in her simple functional uniform, she ran down the hallway, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She could see it at the end of the corridor, a seamless wall of brushed titanium, indistinguishable from the rest of the decor. As she reached it, a section slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss. She stumbled inside into a space that felt like the belly of a spaceship, cold metallic and lit by the glow of a dozen monitors. A moment later, Marcus Thorne entered behind her, his presence filling the small room with an aura of immense controlled power. He didn't look at her. He didn't ask if she was all right. His eyes were locked on the door. With a final definitive thud that vibrated through the floor, the titanium slab sealed them in. The outside world was gone. They were safe. They were trapped. The sudden change in pressure and the heavy silence woke Lily. Her eyes fluttered open, and taking in the strange cold surroundings, she began to whimper, a small, frightened sound in the suffocating quiet. Only then did Marcus turn his full attention to them. His eyes, dark and unreadable, swept over Sarah, lingering for a fraction of a second on her worn uniform, before settling on the crying child in her arms. There was no compassion in his gaze, only a cold assessment of an unacceptable variable, a contamination in his sterile sanctuary. "State your name," He commanded, his voice low and resonant, devoid of any warmth. It wasn't a question. It was an order. "Sarah Jenkins," she stammered, pulling Lily closer. "The temp agency sent me. This is my daughter. I am aware of who you are." He cut in, his voice sharp. "What I am not aware of is why you are in the residential wing's primary safe room. Your protocol was the secondary unit in the staff quarters. There wasn't time," she whispered, her own fear now mixed with a spark of indignation. "The lights. I ran." He turned away from her, his attention shifting to the bank of monitors. On them, silent, ghost-like figures in tactical gear were sweeping through the upper floors of his home. He studied their movements, his face an unreadable mask of concentration. To him, Sarah and her daughter were no longer people. They were a complication, a distraction from the tactical problem he needed to solve. Lily's whimpering grew into a full-blown, terrified cry, the sound echoing off the metal walls, amplifying the sense of confinement. The sound grated on Marcus's nerves, a chaotic, emotional noise in his world of cold logic. He shot a glare in their direction, a look of pure, undiluted annoyance. Desperate Sarah rocked her daughter, whispering soothing words that were lost in the child's cries. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for anything, any distraction that might calm her daughter. And then she saw it. Sitting alone on a sterile stainless steel shelf, looking completely out of place, was a small, old-fashioned wooden box. Panic has a sound. For Marcus, it was the uncontrolled, piercing cry of a child he did not know, a sound that bypassed $1 billion of technology to drill directly into the frayed edges of his soul. The little girl Lily was now fully awake, her small body trembling. Her cries were not just noise. They were an accusation, a raw human distress that had no place in this hermetically sealed world of logic and control. Marcus's jaw tightened. Every instinct, honed by years of risk assessment and emotional suppression, screamed at him to neutralize the disruption. But Sarah wasn't looking at him. Her universe had shrunk to the tear-streaked face of her daughter. She bounced her gently whispering, frantic, loving nonsense, her own fear a secondary concern to the immediate, overwhelming need of her child. Her eyes scanned the sterile room, a desperate search for a focal point, a distraction, an anchor in the storm. And then she saw it. On a cold stainless steel shelf nestled between a sealed medical kit and a stack of vacuum-packed nutritional bars sat the wooden music box. It was old, the dark cherry wood scuffed at the corners, a stark organic contrast to the cold precision of its surroundings. It was an anomaly, a whisper of a different time. For a split second, she hesitated. This was his sanctuary, his fortress. Every object likely had a purpose, a place. But Lily's sobs were growing more ragged, her small chest hitching with panic. Maternal instinct won. It always did. With a trembling hand, Sarah reached out and lifted the box. It felt warm, real. She rested it on her lap and, with a soft click, lifted the lid. There was a faint, whirring sound, the gentle mechanical sigh of old clockwork stirring to life. And then the music began. It wasn't a grand symphony or a complex classical piece. It was a simple, haunting melody, each note falling into the tense silence with the clarity of a raindrop on glass. The effect on Marcus was immediate and violent. He flinched as if he'd been struck. The tactical tablet he was holding slipped from his numb fingers, clattering onto the titanium floor with a sound that was shockingly loud. His carefully constructed composure shattered. His breath hitched a ragged, painful gasp. The cold fury in his eyes vanished, replaced by a tidal wave of disbelief, of raw, unshielded agony. The room, the intruders, the crying child, it all dissolved. He was standing in a sun-drenched garden. the scent of roses and freshly cut grass. He could feel the familiar weight of a small body in his arms, see the dappled sunlight on his wife Amelia's face as she hummed her eyes, sparkling with a love so pure it was its own form of light. She was humming that song, the one her grandmother had taught her, a forgotten folk lullaby from a place they'd never been. It was their secret, a melody that belonged only to them and their daughter, Maya. The memory fractured, and he was back in the cold grey box, the last lingering note of the music box, fading into the hum of the air recyclers. The silence that followed was heavier than before, thick with questions he hadn't allowed himself to ask in a decade. Lily had quieted, mesmerized by the tune. But Marcus was moving. He crossed the small space in 2 long strides, his body radiating a desperate raw energy that was far more terrifying than his previous cold anger. He stopped just before Sarah looming over her. That song, he said, his voice a hoarse rasp, broken. "Where did you hear it?" Sarah flinched, pulling Lily tighter. I don't know. It was just in the box. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have touched it. Don't lie to me. His voice dropped to a menacing whisper, and he leaned in closer, his eyes boring into hers. Nobody knows that song. It was hers. It was my wife's. The accusation, the raw pain behind it, left Sarah breathless. She looked at this powerful broken man, and for the first time her fear was mixed with a sliver of profound, confusing empathy. "I'm not lying," she said, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. I've heard it before. A long time ago. I think my mother used to hum it when I was a child. I don't remember where she learned it. It's just a feeling, like something from a dream." Her explanation didn't calm him. It only deepened the storm in his eyes. He stared at her, then down at the small, blonde-haired child in her arms, a child who looked nothing like his own yet, who had been soothed by the same impossible melody. The tactical precision of his world, a world of ones and zeros, of threats and countermeasures, had been shattered by a ghost. He took a step back, then another, retreating to the far wall of the panic room, as if she were the source of the danger. He turned his back to her, staring blankly at the monitors, at the silent figures of the intruders moving through his home. But he wasn't seeing them anymore. He was seeing a sunlit garden, hearing a voice he thought he'd never hear again. He had built these walls to keep the ghosts of his past out. He never imagined one would find a way inside, riding on the notes of a forgotten lullaby. The silence that followed was a fragile truce, a shared space carved out of the chaos. Outside, the ghosts in tactical gear continued their methodical sweep of the mansion. A muffled crash from the floor above, relayed through the room's sensitive audio sensors, made them both flinch. The immediate danger was still there, a hungry wolf circling their fragile sanctuary. But inside the room, the more immediate threat, the hostility between them, had been disarmed by the impossible ghost of a song. Marcus sank onto a low metal bench, bolted to the floor, the rigid posture of the CEO finally giving way to the slumped shoulders of a grieving man. He stared at the music box, still sitting on Sarah's lap, as if it were a grenade with the pin pulled. For 10 years his grief had been a private, well-ordered thing, a vault within the vault of his life. Now this stranger had found the combination. He felt an overwhelming, illogical need to explain, to reclaim the narrative, to solve the puzzle of how his most sacred memory had ended up in the hands of a temp agency nanny. Amelia, my wife. He began his voice, a low rumble directed at the wall in front of him. She loved old, forgotten things. She said they had more soul than anything new. She found that lullaby in a dusty book in a second-hand shop in Paris. It had no title, no author, just notes on a page. She claimed it was magic. He paused, a ghost of a smile touching his lips before vanishing. Maya, our daughter. She wouldn't sleep for anyone but Amelia. And Amelia would sing that song every night. It was the soundtrack to the only part of my life that ever truly mattered. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped so tightly the knuckles were white. He was no longer the master of the universe. He was just a man tracing the faded lines of a map that led only to pain. Maya had my eyes, but she had Amelia's spirit. She would find beauty in anything. A spiderweb in the garden, the shape of a cloud, the freckles on her nose. His voice cracked on the last words. He took a sharp breath, steadying himself. The day of the accident, I was supposed to be with them. We were going to the coast. But I had a conference call, a billion-dollar merger. I told them I'd meet them there. I chose a balance sheet over my own family. He finally looked at Sarah, and for the first time she saw the full, unvarnished depth of his loss. His eyes were not just sad. They were hollowed out, haunted by a decade of relentless self-reproach. This place, he said, gesturing vaguely at the metal walls around them. This fortress. I built it all after they were gone. A monument to my failure. The best security money could buy to protect an empty house. All because I wasn't there to protect them. Sarah listened, her own fear for Lily momentarily forgotten, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. She knew grief. It wasn't the sudden, violent grief of a car crash, but the long, slow, grinding grief of abandonment, of a life lived in the shadow of what could have been. When the heavy silence settled again, she spoke, her voice soft but clear. Lily's father left the week we found out about her heart condition. He said he wasn't built for a life of maybes and hospital bills. She looked down at her own daughter, now sleeping peacefully against her chest, her breathing even. My life since then has been a series of trade-offs, working double shifts to pay for specialists, choosing between a better apartment or saving for her next procedure. My biggest fear isn't that something will happen to her. It's that something will happen, and I won't be able to afford the cure. She gently touched the music box. That melody. I don't have a clear memory of it. It's more like a feeling. My own mother left when I was young. I think maybe it's the only thing she left behind that wasn't a broken promise. Maybe she sang it to me too. And there it was, the connection. Not a bloodline, not a grand cosmic design, but a shared invisible thread of loss and love. Both of them were parents defined by a fierce, desperate love for a child. Both of them were haunted by a ghost, his, of a daughter taken too soon, hers of a mother she never knew. Lily stirred in her sleep, and Sarah instinctively placed 2 fingers on her daughter's wrist, a practiced familiar gesture to check her pulse, to reassure herself she was still there. Marcus watched the simple, loving motion, and something inside him that had been frozen for 10 years began to thaw. In that moment, she wasn't a variable or a complication. She was a mirror. The fear, he said, quietly, his voice filled with a weary recognition. It never really goes away, does it? You just learn to build walls around it. Sarah looked up, her eyes, meeting his. The vast chasm of class and circumstance between them had vanished. Sometimes, she whispered, the walls become their own kind of prison. He nodded slowly, a silent acknowledgement of their shared truth. They were still strangers, a billionaire and a nanny, trapped by a physical threat they couldn't see. But in the cold, metallic heart of the fortress, surrounded by the echoes of their pasts, they were no longer completely alone. For a time, the assault on the door stopped. The high-pitched scream of the drill died, leaving a ringing in its wake. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was different from before. It was not the sterile silence of the sealed room, nor the heavy, emotional silence that had followed their confessions. This was a watchful, predatory quiet, a hunter holding its breath. Marcus rose from the bench, his body language shifting back from grieving man to security specialist. He moved to a seamless panel on the wall, pressing his palm against it. A compartment slid open, revealing a neatly organized cache of survival supplies. He retrieved 2 foil-wrapped bricks and 2 bottles of purified water. He turned and held one of each out to Sarah. The gesture was stiff, a logistical necessity, not an offer of comfort. "You need to keep your strength up," he said, his tone flat. Sarah took them, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. The brief contact was like a static shock, a reminder of their sheer physical proximity. Lily was still asleep, her fever having subsided to a warm, damp sheen on her forehead. For that small mercy, Sarah was profoundly grateful. She peeled back the foil on the brick. It was a dense, pale, unappetizing bar of compressed nutrients. She took a small bite. It tasted like sweetened cardboard. She looked at the bland bar in her hand, then around at the cold, gleaming surfaces of the multi-million-dollar bunker, and finally at the stoic, formidable billionaire who was now her reluctant roommate. The sheer uncut absurdity of it all struck her. A small, tired smile touched her lips. "Well," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I've had worse first dates. At least the snacks are efficient." Marcus froze mid-sip from his water bottle. He didn't laugh. Laughter was a foreign language he hadn't spoken in a decade. But he looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, his expression was not one of annoyance or pained memory. It was one of pure, startled surprise. A flicker of something human and unexpected sparked in his dark eyes before he quickly masked it, turning back to his monitors. But the shift had happened. The air in the room had changed. "I need to find a blind spot," he said, his voice all business again, but the hard, accusatory edge was gone. "They've locked me out of the primary feeds, but they can't control the raw data stream from the internal sensors. It's too much information for them to scrub in real time." He brought up a cascade of scrolling code and data maps on the main screen. It was a chaotic waterfall of information, meaningless to an untrained eye. "I can't monitor the packet data and watch the thermal imaging." At the same time, he admitted a rare confession of limitation. He pointed to a smaller screen displaying a shifting, heat-mapped schematic of the mansion. "Watch this. The intruders will show up in red or orange. I need you to tell me if any of them stop moving for more than 30 seconds, especially near the West Wing. It could mean they're setting up a secondary breach point." "Okay," Sarah said, moving to stand beside him. She wasn't his employee anymore, or an intruder. She was a spotter, a second pair of eyes. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a strange and unlikely team, their shared purpose a fragile bridge across the vast gulf that separated their lives. For several long minutes, the only sounds were the quiet hum of the machines and their own steady breathing. Sarah's eyes burned from staring at the screen, but she didn't look away. She was good at watching it, noticing the small details. It was the core of being a nurse. It was the core of being a mother. Suddenly, a speaker crackled, making them both jump. A voice distorted by static filled the room. "Sir, Marcus, can you... Static. Hear me, David." Marcus breathed, leaning close to the speaker grill. "I read you. What's your status?" "They've... cut primary comms. We're blind. They're not common thieves, sir. They're professionals. They're not trying to get out. They're crackle, trying to get something. The line went dead. The brief moment of levity, the shared, absurd humanity of the survival bar was gone. The silence rushed back in, heavier than ever now, filled not with the ghosts of the past, but with the clear, terrifying, and unknown purpose of the men hunting them in the present. Marcus and Sarah looked at each other, the unspoken question hanging in the air between them. What in this house was worth more than a billionaire's life? David's fragmented warning hung in the air long after the speaker had fallen silent. They're not trying to get out. They're trying to get something. The words shifted the very nature of their predicament. This wasn't a random home invasion. It was a targeted strike. And they were trapped in the vault with whatever the prize was. The thought was cut short by a new sound. It started as a low, guttural vibration, a tremor felt more in the bones than in the ears. It was coming from the direction of the door. The sound grew sharpening into a high-pitched metallic whine, the unmistakable screech of industrial-grade diamond on titanium. The exploratory probe was over. The assault had begun. The floor beneath them began to shudder with a violent rhythmic intensity. A fine, almost invisible dust, shaken loose from some hidden crevice, danced in the beams of light from the monitors. The noise was no longer just a sound. It was a physical presence, a malevolent force pressing in on them, seeking to crush the very air they breathed. Sarah reacted instantly, her body a shield. She pulled a sleeping Lily onto her lap, pressing the child's head against her chest and covering her ears with her hands, a futile but deeply instinctual gesture to protect her from the onslaught. Marcus stood rigid, his eyes locked on a schematic of the door on the main monitor. A glowing red dot appeared, indicating the precise point of the drill. His face was a mask of cold, analytical rage. He was a general watching the walls of his city being breached. But this time, his gaze kept flicking back to the woman and child huddled in the corner. They weren't a complication anymore. They were civilians in his care. They were his responsibility. The screeching intensified, a relentless, nerve-shredding shriek. Lily's eyes flew open. She didn't scream, her small face already pale with fever, contorted in pure, uncomprehending terror. Her breath started to come in short, shallow gasps. A faint, bluish tint began to color her lips. "No, no, no," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with a new, more terrifying panic. She laid Lily down on the cold floor, her nurse's training taking over. She checked her daughter's airway, tilted her head back. "Lily, baby, breathe for Mommy. Breathe." But Lily's breaths were becoming more ragged, a faint wheezing sound underlying each gasp. Her small chest was barely moving. "It's her heart," Sarah said, looking up at Marcus, her eyes wild with a desperation that eclipsed everything else. "The stress, the noise. It's too much for her. I need her medication. She needs oxygen. Oh God, she can't breathe." Marcus stared down at the struggling child and the panic room, the intruders, the screeching drill. It all vanished. The scene before him dissolved the past and present, merging into a single unbearable tableau of failure. He saw the twisted metal of a wrecked car. He saw paramedics working frantically. He heard the flat, monotonous drone of a heart monitor giving up. He saw his own daughter Maya lying still, so terribly still. He felt the same crushing, suffocating helplessness he had felt that day, the gut-wrenching realization that all his money, all his power, meant nothing in the face of a life slipping away. Not again. The thought was a roar in his mind, a rebellion against the tyranny of his own memory. He would not stand by and watch another child die. He would not be that man again. He crossed the room and knelt beside Sarah, his large frame, a sudden solid presence next to her frantic energy. He placed a hand on her shoulder, the touch firm, grounding. Sarah. His voice was low, but it cut through the hellish noise of the drill with an absolute, undeniable authority. Look at me. She tore her gaze away from her daughter, her terrified, tear-filled eyes meeting his. In his, she saw no pity. She saw a burning, white-hot intensity, a resolve forged in the fires of a decade of grief. "I am going to get you and your daughter out of this room." He said each word, a stone laid in the foundation of an unbreakable vow. "I am not going to fail. Do you understand me?" He wasn't just talking to her. He was talking to the ghosts that haunted him, to the man he used to be. He was rewriting his own ending. "I will not fail you." Sarah stared at him, her frantic breathing hitched. In the face of this powerful broken man, she saw an impossible certainty, a promise made not just to her, but to the universe itself. She gave a single sharp nod, her fear momentarily eclipsed by the sheer force of his will. A new, desperate kind of trust was forged in that moment, a bond sealed by a shared terror and a billionaire's vow. At that exact instant, the screeching of the drill reached a fever pitch and then stopped, replaced by a deep, ominous groan. A small circular section of the titanium door glowed a bright, incandescent red. The breach was imminent. The promise hung in the air, a fragile shield against the screaming metal. And on the other side of the door, the wolf was about to break through. The groan of stressed metal was the only warning. With a final explosive bang, the red-hot circular section of the door blasted inward, spinning through the air like a fiery discus, before crashing onto the floor with a deafening clang. It left a dark, jagged hole, an open wound in the heart of the fortress. For one suspended heartbeat, there was silence. Then, a thin black cable snaked through the opening. An endoscopic camera, its lens swiveling like the head of a viper, methodically scanned the room's interior. On the monitors, Marcus saw the team of intruders, repositioning their dark forms converging on the breach. He knew the next moments would be a storm of controlled violence. He turned to Sarah, his face calm, his eyes burning with an intensity that left no room for argument. "Get behind the main console," he commanded, his voice low and steady. "Take your daughter and stay down. Do not make a sound, and do not move no matter what you hear." "Do you understand?" Sarah, clutching a now silent Lily, could only nod her terror, so profound it had frozen her voice in her throat. She scrambled behind the solid steel block of the server console, making herself and her daughter as small as possible. Marcus strode to a small, featureless panel on the far wall, a section of brushed titanium, identical to all the others. He pressed his palm flat against its surface. A thin blue line of light scanned his handprint. A soft female synthesized voice, the dispassionate voice of the House AI, spoke from a hidden speaker. "Protocol Omega requires dual authorization. Voice confirmation needed." This was it. The last resort. A system he had designed with his engineers as a theoretical final defense, a scorched earth protocol he never believed he would actually use. "Confirm," Marcus said, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "Execute Omega. Omega protocol initiated." There was no alarm, no siren. There was only a deep, powerful hiss that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Vents that Sarah had never noticed opened in the ceiling and floor, unleashing a torrent of dense, white, billowing fog. It was cryogenic nitrogen, a non-lethal countermeasure designed to flash-freeze electronics and induce severe thermal shock. The temperature in the room plummeted instantly, the air turning sharp and bitingly cold. The main lights flickered and died, replaced by the dim crimson glow of emergency beacons, plunging the scene into a disorienting, hellish twilight. Through the swirling, icy fog, a figure stumbled through the breach. Clad in black tactical gear, the intruder was disoriented, by the sudden chaos his night vision goggles rendered useless by the thermal disruption. He raised his weapon, trying to get a bearing. He never got the chance. Out of the red mist, Marcus moved. He was not the calculating CEO or the grieving father anymore. He was a force of pure kinetic will. He slammed into the intruder with the full weight of his body, a brutal, stunning impact that drove the man backward against the metal wall. There was a sickening crunch of helmet against titanium. It wasn't a fight. It was a collision. A second figure was already climbing through the hole, raising a sidearm to aim into the fog. Marcus saw the movement, saw the glint of the weapon. He knew he couldn't fight them both. He had only seconds to make a choice. And in that instant, his promise to Sarah echoed in his mind. "I will not fail you." With a guttural roar, he shoved the first intruder back towards the opening, a desperate blocking maneuver. At the same exact moment, he threw himself sideways, his body a living shield, positioning himself directly between the second gunman and the console where Sarah and Lily were hiding. He saw the flash from the muzzle of the gun. A white-hot, searing pain erupted in his left shoulder. The force of the impact spun him around, slamming him hard against the console he was protecting. A sharp, ragged gasp was torn from his lungs, the air turning to fire. He slid down the smooth steel, leaving a dark smear of red in his wake, his legs giving out from under him. He had paid the price of safety. He had kept his promise. Through the swirling red fog and the haze of his own agony, he could hear new sounds from outside. The breach shouts, the crackle of different weapons orders being barked in a familiar voice. David's team. The cavalry had arrived. But they had arrived a moment too late, or perhaps a moment right on time. Marcus slumped on the floor, his body positioned protectively in front of the console. He tried to turn his head to see Sarah, to see the child. He saw only her wide, horrified eyes in the crimson gloom. He opened his mouth to say her name, but only a choked, wet sound came out. His vision began to tunnel the red emergency lights, blurring into a smear of crimson and black. The last thing he was aware of was not the searing pain in his shoulder or the chaos erupting at the door. It was the profound, bone-deep and victorious relief that behind him in the shelter he had created with his own body, the child was quiet. And she was safe. The world dissolved into a tunnel of crimson and black. The shriek of the drill, the shouts, the chaos, it all faded into a distant, muffled roar, like the sound of the ocean heard from deep underwater. Marcus felt a strange sense of detachment, his consciousness a flickering ember about to be extinguished. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was a pair of wide, terrified blue eyes. Then a new sound cut through the haze. A voice. Clear, authoritative, and familiar. "Sir Marcus, it's David. We've breached their perimeter. We're coming in." The world swam back into focus, slowly, painfully. The red emergency lights still painted everything in blood, but they were now punctuated by the blinding white strobes of tactical flashlights from the other side of the hole in the door. There were sounds of a brief, violent struggle, then the authoritative shouts of "Police! Drop your weapons!" A heavy mechanical groan filled the room as David's team overrode the lockdown from the outside. The titanium door, the one that had sealed them into their tomb, slid open. Light flooded the space, so bright and overwhelming that Marcus had to squeeze his eyes shut against the assault. It was followed by a cacophony of sound radio chatter, heavy footsteps commands being yelled back and forth. Uniformed figures swarmed into the room. The first face to lean over him was David's, his security chief's professional mask of calm, cracking with genuine alarm as he saw the spreading dark stain on his boss's shoulder. "Sir." David's voice was tight with urgency. "Paramedics are right behind me. Two medics in tactical vests were already at Marcus's side, their movements a whirlwind of practiced efficiency. GSW to the left shoulder entry wound looks clean, but he's lost a lot of blood, one said, cutting away the sleeve of Marcus's expensive cashmere shirt. Vitals are dropping. We need to move him. Now. Someone gently but firmly took Sarah by the arm. Mom, we need you to come with us. Sarah clutched Lily tighter, the child's face buried in her neck, shocked into a preternatural silence. She allowed herself to be guided out of the room, her legs unsteady beneath her. The world outside the panic room was a surreal nightmare. The minimalist elegance of the mansion was scarred by chaos, overturned furniture, shattered glass, and the grim, efficient movements of the SWAT team. She felt completely detached, a spectator in the wreckage of someone else's life. Her only anchor was the warm, solid weight of her daughter in her arms. They were in the grand atrium when she saw them wheeling Marcus out on a stretcher. He was pale, his eyes closed, an oxygen mask covering his face. But as if sensing her presence, his eyes fluttered open. Across the chaotic, crowded room, his gaze found hers. The noise, the flashing lights, the shouting, it all melted away. In that one suspended moment, their world shrank to the space between them. In his tired, pain-filled eyes, she no longer saw a billionaire or a cold, angry man. She saw the man who had shielded her body with his own, the man who had kept his promise. He was wounded, vulnerable human. And in her eyes, he saw not an employee or a complication. He saw the woman who had brought a forgotten song back from the dead, the woman whose quiet strength had given him a reason to fight for the dawn. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement that passed between them, a message of a debt owed, and a bond forged in darkness and fear. Then he was gone, wheeled out the massive front doors and into the waiting ambulance. Sarah was led outside a coarse wool blanket, draped around her shoulders by a kind-faced police officer. The cold pre-dawn air was a shock to her system. The sun was just beginning to rise, its pale grey light illuminating the scene, a sprawling mansion surrounded by an army of emergency vehicles, their red and blue lights still silently screaming into the morning. At the edge of the long private driveway, she could see them already. The news vans, the vultures circling, drawn by the scent of tragedy and wealth. She knew a different kind of storm was just beginning. She pulled the blanket tighter around Lily, watching the ambulance's lights disappear down the road. She had walked into this house the day before as a hired hand, a nameless caregiver desperate for a paycheck. She was leaving it as something else, entirely bound forever to its wounded owner by a promise kept in the dark, and a debt she now understood she could never possibly repay. A week passed in a blur of sterile hotel rooms and hushed phone calls from David. The world outside had erupted. The media denied access to Marcus had turned their full ferocious attention on Sarah. She was a hero nanny, a gold-digging opportunist, a tragic single mother, a calculating seductress. Every headline was a new identity, none of them her own. She and Lily were safe in a luxury suite paid for by the Thorne Corporation, shielded from the storm, but it felt like a gilded cage. She was a survivor, but now she was a prisoner of the story. Meanwhile, in a private wing of the city's best hospital, Marcus Thorne was healing. His shoulder was a landscape of surgical staples and deep, throbbing pain, but it was a clean pain, a simple pain. It was nothing compared to the phantom ache he had carried in his chest for 10 years. That ache, for the first time, had begun to recede. His doctors called his recovery remarkable. David called it a miracle. Marcus knew it wasn't a miracle. It was a choice made in a cold, dark room to the tune of a forgotten lullaby. He spent his days in physical therapy and his nights watching the news a cold fury building as he saw how the world was trying to tear Sarah apart. He saw their faces, the pundits, the gossip columnists, and he recognized their brand of violence. It was the same bloodless character assassination he had perfected in the corporate world, and they were aiming it at the woman who had, in her own quiet way, saved his life. On the 8th day, he made a decision. He didn't summon Sarah to his damaged mansion or a sterile boardroom. He asked David to arrange a meeting in the one place he owned that still felt pure, the enclosed botanical conservatory atop his downtown headquarters, a lush, sun-drenched sanctuary of green and glass high above the city's roar. When Sarah arrived, escorted by David, Marcus was already there, standing by a wall of cascading orchids. His left arm was in an elegant black sling, but he stood tall, his posture no longer defensive but open. The haunted look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a calm, quiet resolve. "Thank you for coming, Sarah," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "Mr. Thorne?" She began, unsure of what to say, of what protocol to follow in this strange new world. "Marcus," he corrected gently. "I think we're past formalities." He paused, then looked at her directly, his gaze unwavering. "First, I want to apologize. Not for what happened. That was a war brought to my door. But I am sorry for the war that has been brought to yours because of me. You didn't deserve any of it." Sarah nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "It's not your fault." "Some of it is," he said. "I built an empire that attracts this kind of attention. I never considered the collateral damage." He gestured to 2 comfortable chairs. "Please." When they were seated, he didn't offer her money. He didn't offer a settlement. He offered a plan. "I've spoken with Dr. Alistair Finch in Zurich," he began. "He is the world's leading pediatric cardiac surgeon. He has reviewed Lily's files. He is confident that a new experimental microsurgery can fully repair the ventricular septal defect. Not just manage it. Repair it." Sarah's breath caught. Dr. Finch was a legend, a name she had only read about in medical journals, a dream completely out of reach. "I have established a private, anonymous medical trust for Lily." Marcus continued, his voice steady. "It will cover this procedure and any and all of her medical needs for the rest of her life. This is not a gift, Sarah. This is a debt. That night, your daughter's fight reminded me what it was like to have something worth fighting for. That is a debt I can never fully repay." He then slid a portfolio across the table. "This is for you. You are an exceptional nurse. You are calm under a pressure I have seen few soldiers endure. My company is launching a new philanthropic division next year, the Amelia Meyer Initiative. Its goal will be to fund and deploy advanced emergency medical technology, the kind of tech that could have saved them to underserved communities. I want you to help me run it. Not as an assistant, as a director of field operations. Your experience is more valuable than any business degree." Sarah stared at the portfolio, then at him, overwhelmed, speechless. She opened her mouth to protest, to say it was too much that she couldn't possibly accept. "Before you say no," Marcus said, anticipating her, "you have to understand. This isn't for you. It's for me. For 10 years, my money has been armor. It was a wall I built to keep the world out. That night, protecting you and Lily, was the first time I used my resources to protect something other than myself. It was the first time I felt useful, alive. Please allow me to continue." Tears were streaming down Sarah's face now, but they were not tears of fear or sadness. They were tears of disbelief of a hope so profound it was painful. She could only nod. He reached into his jacket and placed a single key on the table. David found a place. It's quiet, secure. A house with a garden. It's yours. Consider it hazard pay. Later that afternoon, they stood in the doorway of a beautiful sun-filled house on a quiet, tree-lined street. It was warm and inviting, furnished with a simple, elegant comfort. Lily, delighted, immediately ran into the living room, her laughter echoing through the empty space. Sarah watched her, a hand over her mouth, her heart overflowing. "Oh my goodness," she whispered, a typical mother's worry surfacing through her joy. "I hope she doesn't break anything." Marcus stood beside her, his good arm resting on the doorframe. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face as he watched Lily investigate a sunbeam on the floor. "It's fine," he said, his voice laced with a dry, unfamiliar humor. "I already insured everything in it, including future crayon marks on the walls." Sarah turned to him, laughing through her tears. In that moment, the last of the walls between them crumbled. He looked at them, this woman and her child, this impossible pair who had breached his fortress and crashed into the barren landscape of his life. And for the first time in a decade, standing there on the threshold of a new beginning, Marcus Thorne didn't feel the need for walls. He felt simply home. Sometimes the strongest walls we build are not made of titanium, but of grief and regret. We lock ourselves inside, believing we are safe, only to find we have built a prison for our own heart. But what happens when an unexpected melody slips through the cracks, a chance encounter that forces us to face the ghosts we've tried so hard to forget? The journey from a cold fortress to a warm home reminds us that true redemption isn't about erasing the past, but about having the courage to protect someone else's future. This story of an unlikely family forged in crisis left us speechless. How did it make you feel? What was the one detail that moved you the most? Was it the impossible lullaby, or the final quiet promise of crayon marks on the walls? Let us know in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to leave a like. And if you believe someone out there needs this message of hope, please share it with them. And of course, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next emotional journey we have in store. Thank you for listening. And remember, sometimes the greatest risks we take are not with our fortunes, but with our hearts.